There are kings remembered for their courage. There are kings remembered for their wisdom. And then there are kings remembered for their crimes. But among them all, one name stands alone, not written in glory but in blood. He ruled not just a kingdom but an illusion. A man who built his throne on gold and bones. A monarch who smiled for the cameras of Europe, while, thousands of miles away, his empire screamed. His name was Leopold II, King of Belgium. But history remembers him by another name, the monster of the Congo. It began not with war, but with a dream of greatness. Leopold was not born to be a conqueror. Belgium itself was small, peaceful, overshadowed by Europe's giants, Britain, France, Germany. Yet deep inside the marble halls of his palace, Leopold burned with a hunger that no crown could satisfy. He wanted an empire, a place where he and he alone could rule as a god. In the late 19th century, Africa was the last great frontier. Europe called it the Dark Continent. To Leopold it was not darkness, it was opportunity. An untouched land of ivory, rubber, and riches beyond imagination. But he could not simply invade. Belgium's parliament refused to support any colonial adventure. So he crafted a lie. He would not take Africa by force. He would take it in the name of humanity. He presented himself to Europe as a humanitarian king, a man devoted to ending slavery, spreading Christianity, and bringing civilization to the native people. He spoke at international conferences about the moral duty of Europe to save Africa from chaos. And Europe believed him. France applauded. Britain nodded. Even the Pope blessed his mission. In 1885, the world recognized his claim, a vast territory in Central Africa, nearly 80 times the size of Belgium. He called it the Congo Free State. But there was nothing free about it. It was his private property. Not Belgium's. Not Europe's. Every man, every river, every tree, every life, belonged to King Leopold II. What began as a philanthropic project soon turned into one of the darkest nightmares in human history. The king sent an army, not soldiers but mercenaries. The force public, a brutal militia trained to collect ivory and rubber from the native people. But rubber does not flow easily. It takes labor, sweat, and fear. So the force public made sure there was fear. Villages were burned. Men were chained. Women and children were taken hostage. Those who failed to meet their rubber quota paid with their lives. To prove their kills, soldiers were ordered to bring back the severed hands of their victims. Hands, by the thousands. Piled up like trophies, photographed as evidence of discipline. Even children were not spared. And all of it, every drop of blood, every tear, every mutilated body, was for one man's fortune. Meanwhile, in Belgium, King Leopold was celebrated as a visionary ruler. He built monuments, museums, and palaces with Congolese wealth. He hosted royal banquets, wearing a smile so calm, so regal, that no one could imagine what his empire truly was. Europe adored him. He was the civilized king who brought progress to Africa. But the truth has a way of bleeding through lies. Missionaries began to write letters filled with horror. Travelers told stories that no one wanted to believe. The jungle whispered secrets that could not stay buried forever. One man, an Englishman named Edmund Dean Morel, noticed something strange. Ships leaving Belgium for the Congo carried guns and chains. But when they returned, they were filled with ivory and rubber. No goods, no trade, only exploitation. He realized what was happening. The Congo was not a colony. It was a slave camp. As the reports spread, the illusion began to crumble. The humanitarian king was exposed as one of history's greatest deceivers. But for Leopold, exposure meant nothing. He had already become one of the richest men in Europe, his wealth drenched in human misery. Yet the worst part of the story was not just the brutality. It was the silence. The world knew, and still it looked away. They called it progress. They called it civilization. But in the Congo, millions of voices cried out, unheard, unseen, erased. And at the center of it all sat a man in a velvet chair. A king who believed himself untouchable. A man who thought the world would never know. But history remembers. The ghosts of the Congo remember. And so will we. There comes a time when even the strongest illusions begin to fracture. For King Leopold II, that moment arrived not with a scream but with a whisper. Letters from missionaries, travelers, and traders began slipping through the cracks of censorship. Words soaked in horror, describing a paradise turned prison. They spoke of villages erased from maps. Of mothers watching their children die for failing to gather enough rubber. Of soldiers collecting hands like coins, proof that bullets were not wasted. Each letter was a crack in Leopold's golden mask. And soon the mask began to fall. In Europe, the world was starting to listen. Newspapers printed headlines that dared to question the smiling monarch. What was happening in the so-called Congo Free State? Was the king's charity built on bones? Leopold tried to silence them all. He paid journalists to print stories praising his humanitarian mission. He sent ambassadors to deny the reports. And when that failed, he used the oldest weapon of power, fear. Critics disappeared. Witnesses were threatened. But truth is a river, you can dam it for a while but eventually it breaks through. In 1903, a British diplomat named Roger Casement was sent to investigate. He journeyed deep into the Congo's jungles where few Europeans dared to go. What he found was not civilization, it was hell on earth. Casement met survivors who had lost everything. Men with missing hands. Women whose families were taken as hostages. Children who had seen their villages burned in the name of the king. He documented every story, every wound, every scar. His report would later shock the conscience of the world. But even then Leopold fought back. He called Casement's findings exaggerations. He claimed his critics were jealous of Belgium's success. And for a while he almost succeeded. Because the world, as always, prefers a comforting lie to a painful truth. Yet not everyone was blind. Among those who stood against him was Edmond Dean Morel, the shipping clerk turned crusader. He had never set foot in Africa, but he had seen enough on the docks of Antwerp to understand the scale of the crime. He wrote, he lectured, he shouted, until the silence broke. With Casement's report as proof and Morel's passion as fire, the movement to expose Leopold spread across continents. Artists, writers, and activists joined the cause. One of them was Mark Twain, who wrote a scathing pamphlet titled King Leopold's Soliloquy, a fictional confession where the king himself mocks his victims and justifies his crimes. It was satire, but it was also truth. And it burned through Europe like wildfire. Under mounting pressure, Leopold finally agreed to an official inquiry. But even that was a performance, controlled, censored, staged. He thought he could bury the truth once again. Yet the world had seen too much. By 1908, the outcry could no longer be silenced. The Belgian government, shamed by its own monarch, forced him to relinquish the Congo. His private kingdom was over. But justice never came. There were no trials. No reparations. The Congo Free State became a Belgian colony, still exploited, but no longer personally owned by the king. Leopold, now old and ill, retreated into his palaces. He built monuments to himself, cathedrals, museums, gardens, all with the money drenched in Congolese blood. And when he died in 1909, the people of Belgium celebrated. Not with mourning, but with cheers. As his funeral carriage passed, crowds jeered, shouting curses at the man they once called the builder of Belgium. The mask had finally shattered, revealing the face of a tyrant who had fooled an entire world. Historians estimate that during Leopold's reign over the Congo, 10 million lives were lost. 10 million souls erased by greed. 10 million voices silenced by one man's dream of greatness. He never faced justice. He never apologized. And yet, in the quiet jungles of Central Africa, the land still remembers. The rivers still whisper. And the ghosts still walk. Because power fades, but guilt echoes forever. When the gates of Leopold's Congo finally closed, the world believed the nightmare had ended. The king was dead, the colony had changed hands, and Europe washed its conscience clean. But shadows do not vanish so easily. They linger, in the soil, in the stories, in the eyes of those who survived. The jungles of the Congo still hid secrets too heavy for the wind to carry. Rusting chains swallowed by vines. Ruins of posts where men were whipped until the ground itself turned black. Children grew up playing among the skeletons of villages that no longer had names. Generations passed, and yet the silence endured. The new rulers promised order, progress, civilization, the same words Leopold once used. But beneath the uniforms and flags, the machinery of exploitation kept grinding. The mines that had once produced ivory and rubber now produced copper and uranium. The wealth still flowed north, across oceans, while the Congo remained in darkness. Leopold was gone, but his ghost had learned to wear new faces. In Belgium his palaces still stood. The marble floors polished. The statues untouched. Visitors admired his architecture, his vision, his modernization. Few spoke of the millions who paid for it with their lives. History, after all, is written by those who survive it, and edited by those who benefit from forgetting. But history has a way of bleeding through cracks. Over the decades, researchers began to uncover forgotten reports, photographs, and testimonies. Black and white images of Congolese men with missing hands. Letters from missionaries describing the screams that echoed through the night. Each discovery was like a ghost whispering, "Remember us." By the 21st century, a new generation began to question the myth of King Leopold II. Monuments once erected in his honor were splashed with red paint, the color of blood. Protesters demanded that the truth be taught, that the victims' names be spoken. Statues fell. Museums reworded their plaques. And for the first time, the world began to see what the Congo Free State truly was, a genocide hidden behind gold and glory. But the deeper tragedy lies not in what happened then, but in what we allowed to happen again. Across the world, the same story continues. Resources stolen, people enslaved, lives destroyed, all in the name of progress. The ghosts of Leopold's Congo do not rest because their suffering became a blueprint, repeated in different lands under different flags. Every empire has its Congo. Every king has his price. And every nation that turns away becomes part of the silence. As for Leopold, his memory is trapped between two worlds, the marble halls that celebrate him and the dark forests that curse his name. He sought to become immortal through monuments, but in the end he achieved immortality through horror. The devil wore a crown, and for decades the world called him a hero. Now, when the wind moves through the Congo basin, it hums like a dirge, a requiem for the 10 million lost. No courts, no confessions, no closure. Only the rustle of trees where hands once gathered rubber, and rivers that still run red when the rains return. Time may erase faces, but not the echoes of their pain. The throne that Leopold built was never of gold. It was built of bones. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of all. That some thrones, no matter how long abandoned, will always remember who sat upon them.